And I want to thank Cindy Brown, who, as you can see, is the program manager for Lambda Living, which is part of Jewish Community Services. We had the pleasure of working with Cindy. I believe, Cindy, it was in 2019 when you organized the panel for our New Face of Aging conference, and
Yes,
we
I
had an
did.
opportunity to learn about some of the unique
Hmm.
issues of LGBT older adults at that time.
Right.
So this is Pride Month. It seems like a very opportune time to bring this subject matter back both to our staff and to our providers who you will be meeting with after this session. So with that, you've got, I don't know how many folks are on, but there's a good number of,
It looks like 75.
well, that's a very good number of Alliance
Yes.
staff that are on here. And I know they're looking forward to hearing from you, talk about this particular group of older adults that maybe the rest of us don't always know enough about their special circumstances. So with that, let me turn it over to you and thank you again very much. The one thing I would add, Cindy,
Hmm.
if after this meeting you have any material that you think would be appropriate for our website, please send that to me.
Okay, will do.
Terrific.
And thank you for that introduction, Max.
Certainly.
Again, if
Certainly.
you aren't muted, please mute your phone. I will take questions at the end, but you're welcome to write them in the chat so that you don't forget to ask them. So, okay, so, you know, LGBT seniors for a long time have been invisible. Uh, people just don't, they see older people and they assume that they're heterosexual. And many LGBT seniors have been forced back in the closet for a number of reasons. And we're going to go through some of that stuff here. So here's a little stat. And I believe this is very low. There has never been an opportunity where, please mute your microphone if you're not muted. There's never been an opportunity to really ask people whether they're part of the LGBT community or not. It was almost in the last census, but that didn't happen. So, these numbers, I believe, are very low. And as I'm at the tail end of the baby boomers, and I just turned 60, and the largest generation is now in their senior years, 55 or older, I guess, or maybe the baby boom ended in 64, I think. So we've got about 4 more years before those folks turn 60. So there are a lot of factors that really set LGBT folks up differently than the heterosexual folks. And one of the reasons is they're twice as likely to live alone. And that's because many of them who were, in the 40s and 50s, which we'll get to, in the 40s and 50s, they were in their, 20s, 30s, when it was really bad to be gay, or society believed if you were gay, you were, evil. And we'll get to the DSM-1 in a minute as well. No children. So, most older folks at least have their children and grandchildren. Families may have disowned them back in the day. They could have been prohibited from seeing their nieces and nephews. And these factors all contribute to the amplified issues that LGBT seniors face. They face the same as other seniors, but all of those are amplified. And social isolation is one of the most, especially now after COVID. Um, so, those are definitely differences we're looking at. Here are some more stats. As I mentioned, the baby boomers are almost done, uh, in terms of becoming seniors. And it the numbers, because the biggest generation was the baby boom generation, there are going to be a lot more seniors in the next couple of decades than there have been ever before. And in terms of the folks that identified as LGBT, it's important to note that word identified as. Uh, and the reality is not many people ask the question. I've been very impressed in recent times about doctors' offices and so forth that actually ask that information on the application. And some people might respond to it by saying, oh, that's none of their business. But I bet that it's straight people are saying it's none of their business, because I want my healthcare professionals to know my background. There are different medical issues associated with different populations. So if someone going to the doctor is less likely to out themselves, it's difficult to say how many of us there really are. And you notice in the second bullet point, people over 65 identified at a much lower rate than those under, between 50 and 65. And those even under 50, the number's even much higher. The younger you get, the more likely people are to self-identify. Um, and in terms of caregiving and support, many LGBT people create our own family out of friends, because many of us have not had the opportunity to really be part of our families or bring our partners home to dinner, especially during holiday time. There are a lot of LGBT folks whose families don't accept their partner, so they choose to have, Thanksgiving or any other holiday meal with their family, friends that are family, because everybody is accepted. Um, so, there are a lot more LGBT folks in this country that are LGBT than we're even measuring. They say 9 million Americans. I bet it's more like, 15 million Americans. So here we're talking about the population growing. So, we are going from, 12.8% over 65 to, in 2030, 19% of the population will be over 65. So, we know that's coming. So we need to prepare for that. And a good portion of that 19% are LGBT, LGBT folks. And, the paragraph below, a lot of providers of the older LGBT folks, there are a lot of concerns and traumas that are and were experienced by these older LGBT folks. And it's super important that if you are providing services to an LGBT client, that you are supportive of them and affirming of who they are. And many of them are afraid to disclose to begin with, because they fear the treatment that they'll receive. So it's so important as providers that we understand that. And I would, I highly recommend on any intake, if the Alliance has intake forms or they're getting information about clients, I would I would highly recommend putting that question, you know, in an intake form. You know, what is your sexual orientation? What is your gender identity? And um, from personal experience, I really appreciate that because it means they see me, they know I exist, and they acknowledge that, and they're prepared to provide the culturally competent and, you know, supportive care that that I need. So, you know, I said we'd get back to the DSM-1, the first diagnostic and statistical manual for mental health, the DSM-1. Now I think we're on like DSM-7 or something. You know, LGBT people or homosexuality, because everything was a blanket homosexuality. We had, you know, we were sociopaths. We had, you know, personality disorders. We had a disturbance, and you know, they really believed that they could cure LGBT people through, you know, psychoanalytic treatment and psychotherapy. And you know, it all comes down to our parents. You know, if I'm a lesbian, it's because I had a dominant mother. If I'm a gay man, I had a detached or hostile father. You know, it's ridiculous. And you know, even those who were able to be open about it and accept the homosexuality in themselves um, were perverted. And, you know, I like that it was satisfying a neurotic pseudo aggression, neurotic pseudo aggression. I really don't even know what that means, but fortunately, that is no longer in the DSM. But, you know, as you can imagine, people in the 40s and 50s, they are now our seniors. 40s and 50s are now 70s and 80s. So, you know, it's really important that we, you know, understand the history of folks. Now, in 50 years, these traumas aren't going to be the same. But, you know, it is trauma nonetheless. So here's a little graphic. So, you know, and again, I think these numbers are low. So, you know, we've got almost half of the LGBT adults 50 and over are over 65. And 20% of those are people of color. And 1/3 of those live below 200% of the federal poverty line, which means, you know, when we see all of this marketing with very affluent gay male couples traveling the world, that's not a representative of what older LGBT people are. Now, obviously, there are some that are more financially secure than others, but a great number of these folks are not financially secure, and most live on Social Security alone, and it's virtually impossible to survive on Social Security alone these days. So these are some of the other issues that set LGBT older adults apart. Um, as I mentioned, disproportionately affected by poverty, um, physical and mental health conditions, because their entire life they have been this, you know, minority for most of their life, something that they had to hide. So whether or not they are or have been seeking, you know, the proper health care, whether or not they were able to get, you know, a secure job because, you know, you could get fired for being gay. There's, you know, there's still discrimination going on, you know, whether it's you go into a restaurant and you get discriminated against, you know, housing situations. and and in long-term care facilities. And we're working with SAGE, which is a national organization. Excuse me. A national organization that advocates for LGBT seniors, and working to get a long-term care patients bill of rights passed that includes non-discrimination for sexual orientation and gender identity. um, these folks have lived much of their lives under the blanket of fear. They're able to come out for the last 2 decades, and then they get into a long-term care setting and they got to go back into the closet. And there was one example. We had a gentleman who moved into an ALF from living by himself. He had been married to his partner for many, many years, and his partner died, his husband died, and he moved into this ALF. I went and I met with him there, and he told me that he has never been in the closet until now. When he went into this facility, there were people who kind of, you know, didn't talk to him or looked weird at him. So he made up a family. He made up a deceased wife and children that lived across the country so they couldn't visit him. And it's really sad when, seniors have to resort to things like that. And, there's still a lot of biases in healthcare. There are a lot of doctors and even emergency rooms that if a transgender person were to come to their office or to be in the emergency room, many doctors will refuse to treat them. And that is a reason why many don't seek healthcare, because they're afraid of the response that they might get. They're afraid of being rejected, which has happened many, many times in their past. So I just want to look at these pictures. These are folks in the 40s and early 50s. Some of these, like these, these sailors up here, they look rather young. They're in their 70s or 80s now. These two women on the bottom, they were very well known. They have both passed. And this is this picture down here is what, a gay bar looked like. And there were, if you were in a gay bar back then, there were constant police raids. And if you were caught dancing with someone of the same gender, when the police came in, you were arrested. So they had these red lights. And if the police came in the front door, there was someone at the front door that would flip a switch. And that would tell the people in the bar that the cops were coming in. So everybody switched partners. And, there was a lot of abuse, a lot of violence against these folks. And, that's the trauma that they lived. Many were arrested and their faces put in the newspaper. Very, very unfortunate situations. So, in the late 60s, you may have heard about, the Stonewall riots. And I have this little video to show.
In the early morning hours of June 28,
Can you see the video? Someone please let me know.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. Thank you.
The Stonewall riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States. We'll look at the roots of the riots, the events, and their lasting impact. In the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was still considered sodomy and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community were often subject to violence, harassment, and discrimination. In New York City, Gay bars were havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. The Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia. The Mafia bribed the police to look the other way. In turn, the Mafia made money overcharging patrons for drinks. Even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort wealthy patrons, threatening to out them to their employers and families. Despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people were also targeted, subjected to violence, and arrested if they weren't wearing what the police deemed gender-appropriate clothing. This oppression and mistreatment came to a head in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. 9 police officers entered the Stonewall Inn in a raid. The patrons were fed up. As the police roughly tried to arrest bartenders and customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people in the hundreds began rioting. They threw bottles at the police and pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd and locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown into thousands. Eventually, the police were able to get the crowd to disperse, but it didn't last long. The riots continued until July 1st. While some criticized the violent and destructive riots, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to others marginalized for their sexual or gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, Pride events are still held on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in cities around the country and even the world. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn and the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall riots may have been violent, but they marked a pivotal moment in history. No longer would people quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientations. Through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility and a momentum that continues to this day.
Okay, so that, that really was the beginning of the gay rights movement. And many of the seniors now who are in their 70s, 80s, even 90s were there that evening, and they fought back. And it's because of them that I have the rights that I have today. And what's interesting in there, they talked about arresting people that are wearing gender non-conforming clothes. I do that almost every day. So I'm grateful that that's not an issue anymore. And, this is a sad percentage. Only 22% feel they can be open about their orientation. And here's an anonymous quote from a 73-year-old. Within the next 2 weeks, I'll be going into assisted living. Due to my financial situation, I will have to share a room with another man. The thought of going back into the closet is making me ill. Frankly, I'm afraid of telling anyone that I'm gay. And that's a pretty common perspective and feeling of people going into these assisted living facilities and nursing homes. So here's another example, and this one refers more about lesbians, why older lesbians are different than their heterosexual counterparts, and why from the very beginning, obstacles have been put in their way to keep them from being successful and self-sufficient in their retirements.
As the American public ages, So do lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. LGBT older adults face the same challenges as other older adults, including financial worries and health concerns. But LGBT older adults face additional challenges. Let's compare two women, Tina and Jackie, who were both born in 1947. In 1967 at college, Tina meets Frank and Jackie meets Francis. On a date with Francis after work, Jackie is seen by a coworker who tells their boss. Jackie is legally fired and takes a lesser paying job at a factory. In 1973, Tina marries Frank, but Jackie is unable to marry Francis. In the 80s, Tina and Frank have children, but Jackie and Francis are barred from adopting. After decades of hard work, in 2010, Frank and Francis retire. Tina takes Social Security spousal benefits. But because the federal government didn't recognize same-sex marriages then, Jackie is denied those benefits. In 2015, right before the freedom to marry becomes available nationwide, Frank and Francis die. Tina pays for her in-home care with her Social Security survivor benefits and funds from Frank's pension. Jackie is denied Social Security survivor benefits, and because she was not a legal spouse, is also denied Francis's pension. Their apartment was rented in Francis's name, and her state lacks non-discrimination protections in housing, so Jackie is evicted when she tries to change the lease into her name. Lacking an income and a place to live, Jackie moves into a nursing home and relies on Medicaid to pay for it. She fears discrimination if she shares stories about her past, so she doesn't talk about her life with Francis. Tina can afford in-home nursing care and has the support of her children. After a lifetime of discrimination, LGBT older adults face economic insecurity, poorer health, and reduced support networks. Find out more about the unique disparities facing LGBT older adults and how to remedy them, as well as the strength and resilience of LGBT adults at lgbtmap.org/older adults.
So this is a website you might want to write down, and SAGE is the organization that I mentioned. From that example, you can see how the disparities can come to pass, and more so in lesbians than in gay men, because even a gay man back then was still a man and had more access. So here are some pictures again from the early prides, and I show you these because these folks are seniors now. These folks are the ones that are coming to the Alliance, and they're coming to JCS for services because they're older, and we provide LGBT services, and hopefully they, in their communities, there are opportunities for them to access services that are appropriate for them. And this, I like to show this. This was in 1975, 5 years after the very first Pride. And on this flyer here, it says, "Christ loves the homosexual just as much." So, even, they're always using religion to, argue against the rights for LGBT people. But, there's a lot of folks that are very open about their orientation and are in the church, all religions. So I think from that perspective, a lot of folks are more accepting, although there are still a lot who aren't. So there's a long way to go. And with what's happening now politically, a lot of folks in the LGBT community are afraid of what's going to happen if they strike down same-sex marriage. What's going to happen to all these folks that got married and so forth. So these are pictures from some of our Lambda Living activities. Here we have workshops that we do. Here was a field trip to the Frost Museum. this was an intergenerational meal. We had a meal with students and FIU students and seniors. And it was really interesting, the interactions between them. And this was a book signing we did with our women's group. So, some of the programs that we are providing help with the social isolation aspect. People are meeting new people, they're learning things, and they're not just, sitting at home by themselves. This is kind of what we do at Jewish Community Services, to, counseling, case management, social activities, educational, online programming, in-person programming, and so forth. And this is just my information, but does anybody have any questions? I see there are, oh, they just yeses. Here, yeah, shock therapy, pray the gay away, conversion therapy, and other nonsense. Yeah, that's still happening today. And as a matter of fact, several years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, we tried to have the county ban conversion therapy, and it did not happen. And that's a really horrible form of child abuse, in my opinion. You can't pray it away, you can't shock it away, you can't conversion therapy it away. It's part of my DNA, it's who I am. And no experience that I had made me this way. And as a matter of fact, I would bet that if you asked any LGBTQ person when they first realized it, if you could have taken a pill to make you like everybody else, would you take it? I would have taken it then, but there's not a chance in the world that I would take it now. I mean, I found that being a part of the LGBTQIA community gives me a perspective that most people don't have. As a white woman, I know exactly what it's like to have people get in your face and tell you you're a horrible, nasty person. And it's even worse for LGBT folks of color. The transgender community, it's horrible. The most attacked group is trans women of color. They get attacked, brutally beaten more than any other, single group. And, we can pass as much legislation as we want, but it's really about, it's really about having the confidence to, be who you are.